If you think Ali Larijani's killing was just another headline in an already chaotic war, you are missing the part that matters most. Because this was not only about one man, it was about what he represented. A channel, a break, a strategist, a survivor. And at this stage of the war, possibly one of the last figures inside Iran with enough credibility to do two things at once. Keep the system together and keep the door to negotiation barely open. Now he is gone. And when a war kills the people who can still talk, what usually survives is not peace, it is escalation. That is why this moment matters so much for the United States. Not because Iran suddenly unveiled some science fiction secret weapon, not because one assassination automatically means American defeat, and not because a single strike changes the military balance overnight. It matters because Larijani's death may have accelerated something much more dangerous, a shift from a war of strikes to a war of pressure points. And pressure point warfare is exactly where U.S. forces become more exposed, because once direct state leadership is decapitated, Iran's remaining leverage does not disappear. It relocates into shipping lanes, into energy infrastructure, into partner states, into militia networks, into maritime choke points, into uncertainty. That is the real story. And if you want the simplest version of it, here it is. Larijani's assassination may have removed one of the few people who could help stop this war from getting wider, while the war itself is already moving toward the exact arena where America is most vulnerable: bases, logistics, tankers, and regional partners. That is the danger. So let's slow this down and unpack what changed. First, who was Ali Larijani, and why did his death hit differently? Larijani was not just another official in a long list of Iranian elites. He was one of the most experienced power brokers in the Islamic Republic, a former parliament speaker, a longtime national security insider, and a veteran of nuclear diplomacy. In the latest phase of the war, multiple reports described him as one of the people effectively helping run the country after the earlier decapitation of top leadership. He was not the supreme leader. He was not a uniformed battlefield commander, but that almost makes his death more significant, not less, because wars do not only run on missiles and command centers, they run on coordination. They run on people who understand the system, who can read adversaries, manage factions, talk to mediators, signal compromise without looking weak, and keep the political machine from spinning into blind revenge. That was Larijani's value. He had already been involved in strategy around nuclear talks. He had reportedly met mediators in Oman just weeks before the war widened. He was a hardline conservative by Western standards, yes, but he was also seen as pragmatic enough to operate in the gray zone between confrontation and deal-making. And that kind of person becomes extremely important when a regime is under severe military pressure. Because not every powerful figure is equally replaceable. You can replace a title. You can appoint a successor. You can reshuffle a command chart. But you cannot instantly recreate trust, institutional memory, factional access, and negotiating credibility. Larijani had all four. That is one reason Bloomberg's framing was so important. After his killing, the question was no longer just who had died, but who was left for the United States to talk to. If the remaining wartime leadership is more hardline, more militarized, and less politically flexible, then the path to de-escalation gets narrower, not wider. And when the off-ramp narrows, battlefield risk rises. That brings us to the phrase in the title, Iran's secret weapon. Let's make this clear. The strongest evidence does not show Iran unveiling some mysterious new missile system that suddenly changes everything. If you use that framing literally, you are overstating the case. But if by secret weapon you mean the thing the United States and its allies keep underestimating in Middle East wars, the ability to turn geography, energy, ambiguity, and escalation management into leverage, then yes, there is a real argument there. Because Iran's most dangerous weapon in this phase may not be a single bomb. It may be the system of pressures it can still activate even while taking heavy losses. Think about what has already happened. The war expanded into direct pressure on energy infrastructure. Iran and its adversaries have been striking or threatening facilities with regional and global market consequences. The South Pars gas field, part of the world's largest gas resource and the source of roughly 80% of Iran's natural gas, came under attack, according to Iranian state media and AP reporting. At the same time, AP reported that Iran has been targeting Gulf energy infrastructure as part of a strategy to drive up oil prices and pressure the US and Israel to back down. That is not symbolic. It is strategic. Because once a war shifts toward energy, it stops being a local fight in a regional box. It becomes a price signal, a shipping signal, an insurance signal, an inflation signal, a political signal. And the Strait of Hormuz sits at the center of all of it. AP reported on March 18th that Iran has made the strait nearly impassable while also selectively allowing some ships through. That selective disruption is crucial. It means Iran does not necessarily need a total closure to create global effects. It only needs enough uncertainty to raise risk, distort flows, spike premiums, and force every government watching to ask the same question. How long can this continue before the economic shock becomes political shock? That is where the United States starts feeling the pressure even if no one is storming an American base on camera, because American military power in the region does not operate in a vacuum. It relies on host nation stability, airspace access, fueling corridors, carrier operations, base protection, logistics hubs, maritime confidence, and allied political buy-in. Pressure the battlefield, and you challenge U.S. firepower. Pressure the system around the battlefield, and you challenge U.S. staying power. That distinction is everything. And Larijani's assassination matters because it may strengthen the side of the Iranian decision-making structure that prefers system-wide retaliation over negotiated exit. Now, look at the pattern that followed. After Larijani's killing, Iran's new supreme leader issued a rare statement signaling retaliation. Around the same time, Israel announced it had killed Iranian intelligence minister Esmail Khatib. That is important because it suggests the war is moving deeper into elite targeting and institutional decapitation, not away from it. And history gives us a warning here. When leadership decapitation succeeds tactically but fails to create immediate surrender, it often produces one of two outcomes. Either the adversary cracks, or it becomes more erratic, more militant, and more willing to widen the arena. Nothing in the current reporting supports the idea that Iran has already cracked. In fact, the opposite picture is emerging. Yes, the regime is degraded. Yes, major leaders are dead. Yes, institutions have been damaged. But the war is still active. Iran is still exporting oil. And Iran is still capable of imposing costs beyond its own borders. That means the United States is not entering a post-war cleanup phase. It is operating in an active escalation environment. Now add another layer, U.S. losses and operational friction. CENTCOM says Operation Epic Fury began on February 28th. By March 1st, it reported 3 U.S. service members killed in action and 5 seriously wounded. Then came the KC-135 loss over Iraq on March 12th. CENTCOM later confirmed that all 6 crew members aboard the refueling aircraft were dead, and said the incident occurred in friendly airspace during Operation Epic Fury, and was not due to hostile fire or friendly fire. That detail matters for 2 reasons. First, it reminds you that war expands risk even without enemy contact. Second, it shows how thin the margin is once a high-tempo regional operation gets underway. A modern force is not just fighters and missiles. It is tankers, maintenance, rescue, routing, fatigue, weather, airspace deconfliction, and non-stop logistical strain. The more the war spreads, the more opportunities there are for attrition, not only from enemy action, but from the sheer burden of sustained operations. So when people hear doomed U.S. forces, the smarter way to interpret that, if we stay inside the evidence, is not American collapse is inevitable. It is this. U.S. forces are entering a more dangerous operating environment where risk is spreading outward from the front line into the larger system that keeps the force alive and effective. That is a serious claim. And it is a supportable one. Because what would a widened Iranian pressure campaign actually target? Not necessarily a spectacular conventional showdown. More likely, a long list of vulnerabilities, regional air bases, fuel depots, shipping approaches, missile defense saturation, allied energy facilities, commercial confidence, and the political tolerance of partner governments. Remember, a war does not have to destroy U.S. combat power to become costly for Washington. It only has to make the mission harder, longer, pricier, and politically less sustainable. And that is why the Hormuz story is so important. AP reported that from March 1st to March 15th, about 90 ships, including 16 oil tankers, still crossed the strait, while Iran also kept exporting millions of barrels of oil. In other words, the waterway is not closed in the simple cinematic sense. It is contested, distorted, selectively navigable, and strategically manipulated. That actually makes it more dangerous. A clean closure triggers one kind of response. A murky, partial, selective disruption triggers confusion. Who gets through? Under what conditions? With what guarantees? What happens to insurers? To naval escorts? To rerouting? To allied politics? To Asian importers? To oil prices? This is where Iran retains leverage even under intense military punishment. It can weaponize uncertainty, and uncertainty is poisonous for military planners. And because once the regional economy, shipping lanes, and partner states all start absorbing pressure, the battlefield turns into a diplomatic stress test. Countries that support the U.S. militarily may become more cautious politically. Countries that do not want the war widened may begin hedging. Energy importing states may push for restraint. Insurance markets will react before politicians do. Financial markets will price in fear before armies finish their daily briefings. That is how a war's logic changes, not with a dramatic declaration, with mounting friction. And that is why Larijani's death could matter far beyond Tehran. Because if he was one of the last high-level Iranian figures capable of structuring a serious off-ramp, then his removal may not weaken Iran in the way Washington hopes. It may weaken the possibility of a controlled ending. That leaves three broad paths. Path 1. Iran is too damaged to sustain meaningful retaliation, and the war wins down under pressure. That remains possible, but the current evidence does not justify assuming it. Path 2. Iran retaliates in a calibrated way designed to hurt U.S. and allied interests without triggering an all-out regional explosion. That is probably the most plausible near-term path, because it matches the pressure point model: selective attacks, partner state pressure, energy shocks, maritime disruption, and proxy-style escalation. Path 3, miscalculation. And that is the nightmare path. Because once top officials are being assassinated, gas fields are being hit, the strait is under pressure, allied energy sites are taking damage, and U.S. forces are operating at high tempo, the room for error gets very small. One missile lands in the wrong place. One malicious strike kills a large number of Americans. One base hit forces a major response. One Gulf partner decides neutrality is no longer possible. One shipping disaster jolts oil markets into panic. And suddenly the war is no longer about sending a message, it is about momentum. This is why the best analysis of Larijani's assassination is not emotional, it is structural. You do not need to romanticize him, you do not need to sanitize his record. You do not need to pretend he was moderate by Western standards. You only need to understand his function. He was one of the people inside the system who could connect force, statecraft, and factional management. Remove enough people like that, and a regime does not necessarily become weak in a useful way. It can become blunt, angry, militarized, and more dependent on narrower circles with fewer incentives to compromise. That makes U.S. forces less safe, not because American power vanishes, but because the war becomes less governable. And governability in war is one of those concepts people ignore right up until it disappears. A war is governable when both sides still have people who can hear bad news, absorb pressure, interpret signals, and stop the machine before it drives off the cliff. A war becomes dangerous in a new way when those people are dead, sidelined, or politically impossible. That is why this assassination may be remembered as more than a strike. It may be remembered as a hinge, the moment when the war's center of gravity shifted from direct punishment of Iran's leadership to a regional contest over endurance, access, cost, and fear. And in that contest, U.S. forces face a very different challenge. Not a neat battlefield, a contaminated operating environment, not just incoming fire, but layered exposure. Not simply, can America hit harder, but can America keep the coalition, the logistics, the political patience, and the economic stability needed to sustain this? That is the question that matters now. Because the United States can destroy targets. That is not in doubt. The harder question is whether it can manage the consequences of a war whose pressure is spreading across the Gulf, across shipping, across fuel prices, and across every base and partner that sits inside the blast radius of escalation. And here is the final twist. The more successful decapitation appears tactically, the more Washington may be tempted to believe the strategic problem is getting smaller, but it may be getting bigger, because every removed Iranian leader can serve two stories at once. Story 1, the regime is vulnerable. Story 2, the regime has fewer reasons and fewer people left to negotiate. Larijani fit exactly into that contradiction. His death proves penetration, it proves reach, it proves vulnerability, but it may also prove something else, that the war is burning through the very people most capable of preventing the next phase from becoming wider, less predictable, and more dangerous for everyone involved, especially the American forces now sitting inside a region where the battlefield no longer ends at the battlefield. So was Ali Larijani himself Iran's secret weapon? No, not in the literal sense, but his assassination may have activated the real one, a form of warfare built on strategic choke points, economic shock, elite decapitation, and the weaponization of uncertainty. And that is exactly the kind of war where even the strongest military can find itself exposed, not because it is weak, but because strength does not erase vulnerability, not in Hormuz, not in Gulf airspace, not across a chain of partner states, and not in a conflict where every strike meant to impose order can also create more chaos. That is why this assassination matters, not because it ended the war, but because it may have made the war harder to end. And when a war becomes harder to end, U.S. forces do not need to be doomed to be in greater danger. They only need to be trapped inside a conflict whose logic is getting wider, harsher, and less controllable by the day. That is the real warning. And it is much more serious than the clickbait version, because the greatest risk to U.S. forces right now is not one hidden superweapon. It is a chain reaction. Leadership decapitation, fewer diplomatic off-ramps, more pressure on energy and shipping, more strain on regional partners, more operational exposure for U.S. forces, and more opportunities for one miscalculation to turn a grinding war into a regional shockwave. If that chain keeps tightening, then Larijani's killing will not be remembered as just another elimination. It will be remembered as the moment the war stopped being mainly about destroying Iran's command structure and started becoming a test of whether America can protect its forces in a region where the map of danger has suddenly expanded. That is the story, and that is why this matters now.